Florida. The land of flowers discovered in spring. It wasn't gold that caught his eye. A Spanish ship creaked toward a coastline untouched by Europe, lush, wild, and exploding with color. As the sails dropped anchor, Juan Ponce de Leon stepped onto a land so vivid, he believed it was sacred. He didn't name it for conquest. He named it for what he saw. A place bursting with life, a place born in spring. He called it La Florida. And the story behind that name is more beautiful and more tragic than history ever told you. The year was 1513. Easter week in Spain, known as Pascua Florida, the Feast of Flowers. A holy time of rebirth, celebration, and color. As Ponce de Leon's ship neared shore, he saw land overflowing with blossoms, thick forests, and coastlines kissed by sunlight. It was more than just terrain. It felt divine. To him, this wasn't just new land. It was heaven in bloom. And so, he gave it a name that captured that first breathless moment. La Florida. Not for a saint, not for a king, but for the season, the flowers, and the feeling of being reborn. But behind that name lies a forgotten story. Of myths, of empires, and of people whose lives would never be the same. A new land, a new name. When Juan Ponce de Leon set foot on that unfamiliar shore, he didn't realize he was reshaping the map of the New World. To the Spanish crown, it was a new territory to claim. But to him, it was La Florida. The land of flowers. A place both earthly and divine. He wasn't the first European to sail west, but he was the first to lay eyes on what would one day become the southeastern tip of the United States. He believed he'd found an island, perhaps part of the Bahamas. But he hadn't. What he saw was a sprawling peninsula, wild and dense, teeming with unfamiliar plants, animals, and people. It was April 2, 1513, springtime in the New World. Ponce had sailed under the Spanish flag, with dreams of exploration, riches, and legacy. But unlike the brutal conquistadors who would come after him, his arrival on Florida's shores was not marked by battle. It was marked by wonder. His journal spoke of wide rivers, soft plains, and endless forests draped in flowers. It was unlike anything he'd seen. So he named it not for war, nor wealth, but for life itself. La Florida, in honor of Pascua Florida, the Spanish Easter celebration of flowers and rebirth. It was a name born of the moment. Of that sacred week. Of the wild beauty that wrapped around his ship like a blessing. But with every name written on a map, there is a deeper truth, a consequence hidden beneath the ink. Shortly after landing, Ponce de Leon and his men began to move inland. But the land was not empty. It had been home for thousands of years to the Calusa, a powerful indigenous people who lived along the southwestern coast. They were skilled fishermen, fierce warriors, and deeply rooted in their territory. To them, these newcomers weren't explorers. They were invaders. Tension escalated quickly. The Calusa resisted Spanish encroachment fiercely. Arrows flew. Skirmishes broke out. What had begun as a poetic landing turned bloody. In later attempts to colonize the region, Ponce was struck by a Calusa arrow, an injury that would ultimately take his life. Still, the name remained. Over the decades that followed, other Spanish explorers tried to conquer and settle Florida. They came with missionaries, soldiers, and settlers. They built forts, missions, and outposts, many of which failed. Florida's landscape was unforgiving. The swamps, storms, and relentless resistance from native tribes made it one of the most difficult regions to control. But the Spanish held on. Because they believed Florida wasn't just a territory. It was a spiritual frontier. A land discovered during a holy season, bearing a sacred name, waiting to be converted and claimed. Maps from the 16th century began to reflect this sacred geography. La Florida appeared boldly along the coastlines. It stretched far beyond the peninsula, sometimes encompassing the entire southeastern United States. To the Spanish, it was all part of Florida. All part of the land first glimpsed in bloom. But over time, that name became more than a place. It became a myth. Stories began to circulate of Ponce de Leon's true motive, that he wasn't just chasing land, but chasing eternity. The legend of the Fountain of Youth took root. A spring hidden somewhere in the Floridian wilderness, said to restore youth to anyone who drank from it. Historians have found no solid evidence that Ponce actually searched for such a fountain. In his own writings, it's never mentioned. And yet, the myth spread like wildfire. Because people needed to believe that such a place could exist. That a land so full of flowers, found during a holy week, could hold the secret to everlasting life. It was, in many ways, Florida's first global identity, a paradise just out of reach, where age could be undone and life could begin again. As centuries passed, Florida remained a place of promise and peril. Spain's grip would weaken. Other empires would circle. But the name endured. Because La Florida had become more than geography. It was a symbol of discovery, of desire, of the thin line between myth and reality. Even now, that name carries echoes of that first moment, when a Spanish sailor stepped onto blooming soil and believed, just for a second, that he had found something eternal. But paradise never comes without a price. And as empires collided and maps changed, the land beneath the flowers would become a battlefield for cultures, faiths, and survival itself, the land that defied time. Florida wasn't just a place marked on a map. It was a living intersection, where old worlds clashed and ancient ones tried to hold on. A land wrapped in flowers, yes, but soaked in centuries of resistance. After Ponce de Leon's first landing, Spain spent more than 200 years trying to tame Florida. But the land refused to surrender. Again and again, expeditions failed. Missions were burned. Forts were abandoned. Nature itself became an obstacle, swamps swallowing horses, mosquitoes spreading fever, hurricanes tearing down what men built up. But even more unyielding than the wilderness were the people who had always called this place home. Florida was not empty when it was discovered. It was a mosaic of thriving indigenous nations. The Calusa in the southwest, the Timucua in the north, the Appalachee in the panhandle. Each had their own languages, cultures, beliefs, and each defended their homelands with unwavering resolve. The Calusa were known as fierce naval warriors, navigating the Gulf's waters in dugout canoes. They built cities atop shell mounds, raised children in complex societies, and kept Spanish settlers at bay for decades. The Timucua built ceremonial centers and lived in organized chiefdoms, their communities spread across the northern interior. The Appalachee were farmers and builders, with vast networks of trade and diplomacy. They had no intention of giving up their land to foreign gods and foreign flags. But foreign powers kept coming. In the 1560s, the French Huguenots established Fort Caroline near modern-day Jacksonville, threatening Spain's hold. Spain responded with brutal force, sending Pedro Menéndez de Avilés to wipe them out. Hundreds of French men, women, and children were slaughtered in the name of Catholicism and Spanish sovereignty. The fort was burned. Its memory buried. In 1565, Menéndez founded St. Augustine, the oldest continuously inhabited European settlement in the continental U.S., but even as the Spanish laid claim, Florida remained restless. Behind the stone walls and wooden crosses, battles still raged. For the indigenous peoples, colonization meant more than the arrival of strangers. It meant disease, enslavement, erasure. Smallpox, measles, and influenza tore through native populations with devastating speed. Tribes that had stood strong for thousands of years were hollowed out in a matter of decades. Cultures disappeared. Languages died. And yet, some survived. The Seminoles emerged in the 1700s from remnants of displaced tribes and African fugitives. They carved a new identity in the marshlands, refusing to be broken by colonizers or borders. They would later fight 3 wars against the United States, the longest and costliest of all the Indian Wars, and never formally surrendered. Florida, once named for spring and flowers, had become a battlefield soaked in blood and memory. Then came the British, after Spain ceded Florida in 1763. For 2 decades, Britain controlled the territory, remapping it, renaming parts of it and exporting lumber, rice, and indigo. But Britain's grip didn't last. Spain regained control in 1783, only to lose it again, this time to a new power rising in the north. By 1821, Florida was under American control. And while the name remained, Florida, the meanings layered beneath it kept shifting. From sacred land, to Spanish outpost, to imperial prize, to southern frontier. Yet somehow, through the wars and treaties and conquests, Florida never lost its aura. It remained different. Wilder. Timeless. Unlike the other colonies, Florida didn't conform. It resisted agriculture. It resisted urbanization. Even its geography fought back. Its swamps swallowed armies. Its Everglades defied mapping. Its storms erased entire settlements. And still, people came. Because even in chaos, Florida offered something the rest of the country could not: freedom and reinvention. Escaped slaves found sanctuary among the Seminoles. Runaway dreamers wandered south in search of new beginnings. Poets, pirates, outlaws, priests, they all found something here that they couldn't find anywhere else. Florida had become the land that didn't just defy kings, it defied time. It held onto its ancient roots even as flags changed. It protected its secrets in tangled mangroves and hidden springs. It whispered stories through palmetto leaves and ocean winds, stories that most never heard but always felt. And through it all, the name stayed. La Florida. First written in the logbook of a Spanish explorer, now printed on every map, every license plate, every dream of sunshine and escape. A name that bore witness to every chapter, every clash, every rebirth. But a name, no matter how beautiful, can't survive this long without meaning. Without roots. And perhaps, that's what makes Florida different. Because this land was never just a paradise. It was never just a prize. It was something deeper. Something older. Something that refused to be rewritten. And maybe that's why the name still holds power. Because beneath the surface, beneath the flowers, the myths, and the modern image, Florida still carries the weight of its first impression, and the sacred bloom that gave it its name. A name that still blooms. When Juan Ponce de Leon stood on Florida's shore and gave it a name, he had no idea what it would endure. He could not have imagined the centuries of conflict, the layers of meaning, the lives it would touch. And yet, over 500 years later, that name, La Florida, still blooms in the American imagination. It's more than just a name on a map. It's a feeling. A vision. A promise. Say it out loud, Florida. It doesn't sound like a place. It sounds like an idea. Warmth. Color. Escape. A breath of air after a long winter. A second chance. And maybe that's because from the very beginning, it was rooted in renewal. In life. In something holy. It began with flowers. Pascua Florida, the Spanish celebration of Easter, rebirth, and the coming of spring. When Ponce de Leon arrived during that sacred season, the land was bursting with blossoms. He didn't name it for its people, its terrain, or its riches. He named it for its beauty. For what it made him feel. Even now, Florida is one of the most biologically diverse states in the country. Home to more than 4,000 species of plants. Endless groves of oranges, swaths of wild orchids, and hidden corners of untouched green. The name is still true. Still alive. But that beauty, like the history that shaped it, is not without complexity. For centuries, Florida has been a place where myth and truth collide. A playground and a graveyard. A paradise and a battleground. A place that has attracted those seeking healing, refuge, or reinvention, and one that has often been built on pain, exile, and erasure. It was where the Seminoles hid from soldiers, where enslaved people fled for freedom, where empires rose and fell, where memory lingers in moss-covered trees and broken fort walls. And yet, the image of Florida has always been drenched in sunlight. Why? Because we need it to be. In every era, Florida has become what people most desperately wanted it to be. To the Spanish, it was a sacred place, named in honor of faith and flowers. To the French, it was a stronghold for freedom. To the British, a profitable colony. To the Americans, a new frontier. To African Americans escaping slavery, it was a path to liberty. To artists and wanderers, it became a muse. To retirees, a final home. And to millions today, it is where they go to start over. The name Florida has never just described a piece of land. It describes a state of mind. It tells us that something can survive storms and still bloom. That a place can hold its history while still inviting people in. That beauty can exist alongside brokenness. Even the state flower, the orange blossom, is a perfect symbol of this contradiction. It's fragrant, delicate, and almost ethereal. But it also grows from a tree that's been industrially farmed, commercialized, and scarred by hurricanes, disease, and development. The flower endures, even when the harvest fails. It blossoms even after fire. That is Florida's story. A land whose name is gentle, but whose past is not. A name that evokes peace, but holds centuries of war. A name born of beauty, but shadowed by loss. And yet, it still blooms. From the moment it was spoken into existence, La Florida, the name carried something bigger than geography. It carried memory, intention, poetry. And maybe that's why it has lasted when so many others have faded. Because no matter who claimed it, who mapped it, or who tried to reshape it, the name never needed translation. Never needed conquest to survive. It simply described what was already there. And in doing so, it became timeless. Today, we hear Florida, and we think of beaches, theme parks, palm trees. We don't often think of Ponce de Leon or the Calusa or the myths that built the foundation of the state's identity. But we feel it, without knowing why. We feel it when we smell salt in the air. When we watch the sun rise over the Atlantic. When we see flamingos standing in still water. When we drive south in winter, looking for warmth, for rest, for something brighter. The name has endured because the spirit of it, what it represented in that first moment, has never fully left. And perhaps, that's the most remarkable part of all. That after 5 centuries of history, scars, triumphs, and reinventions, Florida's name still means what it meant on that first day. A land full of life. A place touched by spring. A promise that, no matter what came before, something beautiful could still begin. Land of flowers, forever, in a world where names are often forgotten, changed, or erased, Florida's has never wavered. La Florida, the land of flowers. It began as a whispered reverence by a Spanish explorer in the spring of 1513. And today, it's spoken by millions, with every postcard, every road sign, every dream of starting over. But beneath the palm trees and highways, beyond the sunshine and stories, the name still carries what it always did, a vision of life. A land that offered beauty without asking for it. A place that bloomed, even when everything else fell apart. Florida is not just a state. It's a symbol. Of rebirth, of resistance. Of something wild that refuses to be tamed. And that is why, after 500 years of storms, struggle, and survival, the name still fits. Florida, land of flowers, forever. If this story opened your eyes to the meaning behind a name you thought you knew, there are dozens more waiting to be uncovered. Subscribe to the channel for more hidden histories, forgotten truths, and the stories buried beneath the names on the map. Because every state has a soul. And every name has a story.